Seahawks are your Super Bowl champions. A great dominant performance by the defense, and we get into it next on Beyond the Locker Room. What a performance by the Seattle defense. It was a really top-notch performance, one of the best performances by defense. Overall, I mean, they pitched a shutout in the first half and then kind of just cruised on to victory from there. A little help from offense and Kenneth Walker, we'll get into him as he's your MVP. But the third, I should say, and Kenneth Walker the third, and he's your MVP. But overall, a lot of things that I took out of this game I'll get into in a moment, but just congratulating the Seahawks. As a Seahawks fan, it's great to see. Redemption Bowl, the mission has been accomplished, and it was great to see. I must admit, I'll just say this off the top. When it was 9-0 at halftime, I was still a bit nervous because I thought the amount of opportunities Seattle had, I was like, man, knowing how New England seems to have horseshoes in there, what sometimes when it comes to the big games, I was like, don't let this be one of these type of games again. But they put things away in the second half. But let's get into it. On this journey we've been on all year, I thank you for keeping me company on this journey, folks. Appreciate the support. Like, comment, subscribe if you have opportunity, share. But let's get into it on what I saw, why I think Seattle was dominant, and now the Super Bowl champions. So I mentioned a couple of keys that we had to watch for last week, and one of them was the front four of Seattle. Say on the defense, when it's New England's offense versus Seattle's defense, that front four. Could Seattle's defense really put pressure on that, put the pressure without blitzing? Now, they did do exactly that. I think they had tied a record 7 sacks in the Super Bowl. So they definitely did their part, but it wasn't all on the front four, to be fair. We saw blitzes, especially for Witherspoon, coming in off the quarter blitz time again. And so they mixed it up really a lot on New England, caught New England off guard, and quite honestly, I had different advantages for each side, and I gave the advantage to the Seahawks on defense. They definitely lived up to that, and they just and it seemed like New England had no answer for that once they kind of took away, which I thought once they got Maye into a position where he had to pass, it was definitely becoming one dimensional, and that was where the problems really started to happen. From a coaching standpoint, which I did give the edge to Vrabel and the Patriots. Quite honestly, he got his clock cleaned by McDonald. Like Vrabel seems so the Patriots seem so unprepared for some of these blitzes where backs were confused on who to pick up on the blitz. Even when it's front four just rushing only, it's assignments. They couldn't figure out who to chip. It was bad stuff. I mean, and Williams was getting rocked. I mean, on the end. I mean, they didn't matter who they put on that end. They were just feasting over there, and it was tough sledding for this the New England offensive line. I think the other thing was showing that was very apparent was Diggs is Diggs, no two ways about it, but the explosive plays, and part of it was how much time he had or not had, but I think also part of it was how well the secondary covered the New England receivers, that there wasn't a lot of space or guys to be open. I mean, it was tight coverage for the most part all day. With a couple of loose moments there, Woolen being one who seemed like he didn't know the play and got caught in a position where he's kind of backpedaling where they scored the touchdown. But besides a couple of those plays, I mean, for the most part, the secondary was just all over New England's receiving core. I will also say too, I mentioned some of the other things to watch for, which was, could New England actually establish a running game? And we saw that was not the case. New England could not establish a running game. And once that, as I said before, once that got taken apart, then it really became very, very predictable. And I think once again, I mentioned this last week. If you're able to take away the running game, then it makes the running capability of Maye a lot less effective, because now you can actually have a guy shadowing him, and you saw him try to take off a couple times. He got a few yards in some plays and stuff like that, but Seattle's arguably the best tackling defense in the league, and they made sure they nipped that in the bud very quickly. So that was really something to watch, that I was watching for, and they continued doing pretty well. So let's look quickly at what we saw here in the numbers. Let's start with the quarterbacks. Darnold started off really rough. We'll get into Walker in a second, but he started off really rough. It still wasn't great. Quarterback rating was at 53 for the game. He threw for over 200 yards, 202 yards to be exact. 19 for 38, and that percentage actually only got higher up in the second half, in the fourth quarter, I believe, where he was rough. It was rough on him, and from that standpoint, he had a few early passes, where I must admit, that could have been the momentum shifter right there in the first play of the game, where a few passes, even with some of the second half, where I was like, McDonald was throwing these out routes, man, where it's like, man, you're asking for trouble for some pick sixes, and they got away with it. Yeah, Darnold did not look good the first quarter, I would say. I think, and then they kind of calmed things down by leaning on Walker, and that was really their salvation. Kenneth Walker III. I mean, there's argument you could be making this case here for Witherspoon. You can make an argument for, which is an interesting argument for him. He was so dominant with his rushes. But I think, the kicker might even get a little opportunity, perhaps. But he was, Witherspoon in this case here had 4 solos. He had 1 sack, he created a fumble. Quarterback hits, he had 3, so he was like right in the middle of everything on the defensive end. But I think they got it right. Kenneth Walker III stabilized things to kind of break the game open, because let's face it, it was really not going anywhere for either team for pretty much most of the first quarter. A field goal here, a field goal there. It was 9-0 at the half, but you felt in this case Seattle was in control because they had that running game going. Walker ended up with 27 carries for a $135, 5 yards a pop, which is impressive. The long was 30. I mean, he could have had more if it wasn't for the penalty right before the 2-minute warning. So he was fantastic. And I think his ability to get around and get out the side and get the edge, time and time again, his patience that Chris Collinsworth mentioned throughout the game was really, really something to behold. I mean, I thought, it reminded me a little bit of Le'Veon Bell, a little bit for that type of style, just waiting and waiting and waiting, and then kind of then finding your hole and then exploding through it, or taking the corner and taking the edge quickly. That same type of style. He was fantastic. And heck, he's got so much opportunity because Charbonnet was hurt. So give it. Sometimes you got to take advantage of your opportunities when you get them. So good on him. They focused very heavily on making sure they took away the receivers as best they could. JSN, in this case, only had 4 receptions. Cooper Kupp only had, he had 6 actually as a leader. Barner had 4. So even Shaheed in this case only ended up with 1 carry, and he didn't even get any passes really tossed to him really when it's all said and done. So he had the deep ball they just missed on, which would have really ended the game. But they really contained the rest of the receivers, so it was Walker really just carrying the load for the most part, and he was fantastic. Because I guess I said before, Darnold didn't look. I wouldn't say he's seeing ghosts, but he neither quarterback looked up to snuff. And we'll get the other guy in a second, but it was rough. It was rough in this case at the beginning for Darnold. But that was the third point I mentioned for the 3 keys. Could they get Darnold into making mistakes? And they almost got into it. And I think almost. First things first, at this point today, and I agreed with them actually with this. It looks like almost like Vrabel's scenario was, let's just hope that Darnold makes mistakes. And to be fair, how New England has played this postseason was, let's just try to see if we can have the quarterback make mistakes and we'll win that way. And you can't keep relying on that to hope that you'll get mistakes for the other quarterback. Because if a quarterback plays a clean game, not even a superb game, just a clean game, at some point you have to manufacture some offense on your own. And I don't think they seem to realize that was part of the game plan. At least it didn't seem that way. On the other side of the ball, Drake Maye, man, the numbers I think kind of lie a little bit. If you just kind of looked at the Monday morning, you looked at it and say, oh, he's 27-43, threw for 295, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks. But hey, you know what? He had 79. His rating was actually better than Darnold's. You say, okay, you know what? 79.1 rating, 74.7 rating for Darnold. However, the quarterback rating was 53 for Darnold and 16.3 for Maye, and there's where issues lie. Honestly, I didn't think Drake Maye was ready for this. He was ready for prime time. Yeah, he looked a bit like a deer in the headlights. It was taking too long for him. The process was going on, making some really bad decisions on throwing deep balls where there's no chance of his receivers even having a chance for the ball. Not really feeling the pressure as well too. I think, don't get me wrong, you get sacked, you get sacked 7 times, then fair enough. I get that, but or 6 times, whatever it may be, But when you have that, and not all of them are on, not all of them are on the offensive line at some point. At some point, you got to get rid of the ball a little quicker. So that was, he was. It was troubling to see how that played out for him. He only ended up carrying for 5 yards for 5 carries for 37 yards. So that's what I mentioned earlier. They really contained him, and kept him at bay. Therefore, forcing him to just be a drop back passer, and that's where you saw the sacks start coming in, where everybody was reaching, everybody was reaching the summit or getting home. And Seahawks front four, and as well as Witherspoon, they're getting home plenty of times. So that's where, and to be fair, I thought the Patriots defense was really good at keeping their team in the mix, making some key third down stops in the red zone to force a lot of 3s instead of 7s. So props to New England's defense. I thought they were really great. I mean, their all pro corner was fantastic. Gonzalez, he made a game saving touchdown, or a touchdown saving play when he broke it up at the end zone, which really I thought were broken up in the game, before the half. So, and he had another one later in the game. So he was fantastic, easily the best Patriot, on the field that yesterday. So props to Gonzalez, he was fantastic. But yeah, you look at their team. Stephon Diggs had 3 receptions for 37. Hunter Henry had 3 receptions for 31. 4 for Hollins for 78. He was probably the big strike target that got them into the position for the touchdown. And I think he had the touchdown too. Yes, he did. Yeah. So it wasn't really saying much. I'm just for I said these were the key things that would be part of it. I also mentioned it gave the advantage to the Seahawks on the offense because they had a few more explosive players. They had a few more explosive offensive players than New England. And you could see that New England was just trying to keep them at bay as best as they could, to hopefully the floodgates would open up. And the floodgates, funny enough, even though I didn't think Seattle's offense was great, they still found a way to manufacture 22 points out of it. Obviously, there's the run back from the pick, or the fumble, or whatever they wanted to call it. They call it Nuosu had, so that gave you the 29. But I would say Seattle's explosiveness, was kind of maintained, or at least kept in check for the most part of the game by New England's defense. So props to them, as well as the special teams. But I will give the edge to Seattle for special teams, because the fact is their field goal kicker kicked 5 field goals. So it is what it is, people. And that's the reason why I gave that to them. I thought the one thing that might give them a chance was a game plan by Vrabel to kind of keep this game tight in the fourth quarter. And I must admit, I was disappointed with Vrabel's preparation on his team, on both sides of the ball, especially not so much both sides, I should say on the offensive side of the ball. They didn't seem to have any idea. They just assumed in this case here, we'll just feed off of the turnovers of Seattle. Well, what happens if Seattle doesn't turn over the ball? What do you do then? So that to me was the kind of pretty much what summed up the game. Overall, I'll say this much: from an entertainment value, it's probably one of the sleepiest Super Bowls I've ever seen. I had dog in the hunt, as they say, and first half was sleepy as hell. I think the second half obviously was a bit better, that was a rough one to watch for that standpoint for the first half. You really got to be a hardcore football fan. Definitely, folks probably were waiting for the halftime show with Bad Buddy at that point to see what was going to happen, because it was rough, 9-0, and not a lot to say, not a lot to speak about. No real signature plays, in the first half. No one could come to me and tell me what happened the first half and tell me any signature play, where it's some controversial play, some spectacular play. Nothing. It was very humdrum. But hey, the Seahawks are the champs. I guess it now moves. I'll say this: moving into next year, just say with Seattle, could Seattle repeat? It's possible. I mean, they have a pretty young team. They put together a really nice team with a lot of resources and stuff like that, and with Darnold, I think Darnold's at a pretty decent contract. I can't remember what they said. Heard on TV today where he only takes up like 15% of the cap, or some number like that. So they could do a lot of maneuvering because the quarterback is not killing them, taking the majority of the cap or a big slot of it. So that's a real big advantage for Seattle. On the New England side, it could be dicey for New England. Not saying I think all of a sudden Drake Maye is going to turn into like a pumpkin. He did last night, but what I'm thinking is more like I think he's going to have a weight on his shoulders next year that is going to be an invisible weight where it's like, okay, you know what, you're 13-4, great. You're 14-3, great. But what you have for an encore? You got something better than what you did last year, because he did not have a good playoffs at all. I think some of the stats I saw today for First Things First were saying he was actually the worst, I guess, performer that's had a 3-game spell. His first 3 games, I think it might have been as a caveat, ever. And they had some they had like Peyton Manning, who was never great in the playoffs. He surpassed him, so now he's got the lowest rating. Let's put it that way. So I think he'll bounce back, but there's some things from a New England standpoint. They got to get some more explosive guys on outside. I know they say they got guys now, but I think you might want to draft somebody that can really break open the game a lot more than what they have currently. But Vrabel, I think, that was not a good performance for him. He and McDaniels, not a good performance for them. McDaniels has been always questionable in my mind as a big time OC. When it comes to the big games, I know you say so. It's like, well, what do you mean? He's won Super Bowls with Belichick. Fair enough, but there's been a lot of games where I've seen him have some very shaky moments, man, and this was not a good moment for either of them, I would say. But it's another season in the books for the NFL. Give me your thoughts. Love to hear them. By the way, I told you I gave the score as Seahawks 27. New England 15. Almost 2 points going the other way for each team. 29-13. So, hey, your boy seems to know a little something about the game. So keep checking me out, man. We'll be talking about football throughout the offseason. Got draft stuff coming, free agency. So a lot of cool things, to come in the offseason. I've enjoyed this run with you guys. I enjoyed this season of getting back into the flow of things, and I kicked off my first kind of rebirth of the pod with news of Micah Parsons getting traded to Green Bay. So the NFL season kind of kicked things off, and it's been a great joy, a great ride with you guys. So before, we'll have a lot of stuff coming up in the offseason from a football perspective. So once again, where to find me here on X. You can find me on X, you can find me on Facebook, you can find me on Blue Sky, of course on Instagram, and right here on YouTube. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, guys. I appreciate the support. As always, you can find me weekly at Basketball Rewind as well, too. So keep it locked, guys. Take care. We'll talk soon. Peace.